Welcome to Political Science 201, Lesson 10. This is Laura Fleming. Okay, so just a little thought question to get us warmed up. Where did you get your news over the last 2 days? So most college students are going to get their news through social media. So many different social media platforms will have some kind of news feed that will help you learn what's going on in the world. And the second question is, did you identify any bias in your news sources? We know there's bias in the media. You can look at any story, for example, the current coronavirus crisis, and you can see different outlets reporting on that story very differently. Conservative outlets like Fox News will report that Trump is doing a good job managing this crisis, or at least he's doing the best that he can under difficult circumstances. Other outlets like CNN and MSNBC are going to report that Trump is doing a terrible job and that people are dying because of the decisions that Trump has made. So when you see such different reporting over the same facts, you can see an example of bias at work. And you can temper bias by trying to get your news from a lot of different sources. Unfortunately, there's this new phenomenon with algorithms where your social media platform actually gets to know you and gets to know your preferences, and they will actually feed you news sources that they think you will like. So someone who looks at the world from a conservative viewpoint is more likely to get conservative news fed to them on their social media platforms. And if you're more of a liberal persuasion or a Democrat, you're more likely to get news fed to you that's in line with your ideas. And so this turns our news into kind of an echo chamber where we only hear the points of view that we want to hear. And this can be very dangerous. It's important to get outside of your own personal echo chamber, to break through the algorithms and to look around and to see what are different news outlets reporting about a story. So last time we talked about interest groups. These are voluntary associations where people seek to influence public policy either on behalf of a specific industry or for a particular social cause. So we talked about the Chamber of Commerce and the different agricultural industry groups. And we also talked about Planned Parenthood, etc. So today we're going to talk a little more about what interest groups do. And we're also going to talk about the media and bias in the media. And then we're going to talk about how business and interest groups influence the government, and they influence the media, and the media influences business and government. It's this complex web of relationships between businesses and interest groups, the media, and government. So we're going to take a look at that. It can be very perplexing and distorting. So going to interest groups, things that interest groups do. I told you that we would talk a little bit about lobbying, what that means. So an interest group may engage in lobbying. This is direct contact with a member of Congress. So you have an idea that you want to get in front of a member of Congress. You don't feel comfortable trying to do that yourself, and you hire somebody else to do that for you. So they're kind of like hired spokespeople. Very, very common. There are about 10,000 registered lobbyists specifically paid to influence Congress. Many different groups have lobbyists. So drug companies, insurance companies, public utilities, high-tech companies, even some states and cities have lobbyists that are paid to influence Congress. So again, this, feels a little corrupt to us. That you can see this meme they're defining lobbying as legally bribing and/or extorting an elected official. For this reason, lobbying is highly regulated and lobbyists must file disclosure. What does it take to be a lobbyist? Lobbyists patiently cultivate networks of powerful people over many years, trying to build trust, maintain confidence in friendships. When a client hires them to push a specific issue or agenda, they usually form coalitions and try to exert political pressure. Access is important and also means a one-on-one meeting with a legislator. This is why we have this revolving door phenomenon, because if you've worked in government, especially if you've worked in Congress as a member of Congress or as a staff member, you're going to automatically have insider knowledge in these networks of powerful people. Even so, getting access can sometimes be difficult, but there are various avenues: email, personal letters, phone calls, face-to-face meetings, meals, get-togethers, and even chasing after congresspersons on the Capitol building. One lobbyist says, my style of lobbying is not to have big formal meetings, but to catch members on the fly as they're walking between the House and office buildings. So in other words, a lobbyist is a paid stalker. You pay them to stalk down members of Congress. When getting access is difficult, there are ways to wear down the walls. If you can't get in the door, you can't make your case. One lobbyist says, we had a hostile senator whose staff was hostile. We had to get in. The lobbyist safecracker method is to throw fundraisers, raise money, become a big donor. Lobbyists often assist congresspersons with campaign finance by arranging fundraisers, assembling PACs, and seeking donations from other clients. Remember, members of Congress spend massive amount of time on fundraising. So if you have a lobbyist that steps in and offers to help with that, that's a big benefit. Many lobbyists become campaign treasurers and fundraisers for congresspersons. This helps incumbent members cope with the substantial amounts of time required to raise money for re-election bids. Again, we feel uncomfortable with this, but you don't want to ban lobbying. Just like you can't ban factions themselves. Remember James Madison, he said, these factions, these groups seeking to influence public policy, not for the benefit of the nation, but for the benefit of their own members. That's really destructive, but at the same time, it's part of our freedom as Americans to band together and to petition the government, okay? It's part of our free speech rights, our freedom of association rights to band together to try to influence government, even if it's just for our own personal benefits. You can't outlaw lobbying altogether. In addition, members of Congress, if they're honest, they'll say, these lobbyists, they do serve an important function. They serve an educational function. A member of Congress may not know how a particular piece of legislation is going to impact a particular segment of society, and the lobbyists bring this kind of information to the attention of Congress. Okay, so sometimes lobbyists can be sources of educational information, and the member of Congress just did not know or could not have anticipated how a piece of legislation was going to impact a particular group. So lobbying is a fact of life. We don't like it. We understand it smacks of corruption, but at the same time, it's part of our freedom as Americans to try to influence the government, and lobbyists do serve an important educational function. What else can interest groups do? Well, they can also file lawsuits. Okay, they can file lawsuits. If you're not having success making your case in Congress, if you can't change the law directly, remember we have 3 branches of government. One branch of government, the judicial system, we haven't covered it yet, but that's an avenue to change government policy. So what you do is you file what's called a test case on behalf of a sympathetic member who has been wronged. Remember, we talked about the test case in California trying to overturn the Controlled Substances Act as it relates to marijuana. So basically, when you file a lawsuit, you're asking the judge, you're saying, Judge, I need you to strike down this law because it's unconstitutional. So in that case in California, we talked about the pro-legalization lobby. They found two very sympathetic plaintiffs, and they filed the lawsuit on their behalf. When you're filing a test case, you definitely want to make sure that the people you're filing it on behalf of are sympathetic. Okay, so if you're trying to overturn laws that criminalize marijuana, for example, you don't go down to the street corner and pick up a couple gangbangers and say their constitutional rights have been violated. Okay, that's not what you do. You go find two little old ladies who suffer from medical conditions and need their medical marijuana to function on a daily basis. They're sympathetic. You file a test case on their behalf, and you try to put the judge in a difficult position by saying, hey, this law comes down unfairly, too harshly on my client. We think the law is unconstitutional, and we're asking you to strike it down. Okay, that's a test case. Let's say that you haven't found the right person to file a test case on behalf of, and also litigation is very expensive. There's another avenue available to you. So an interest group may file something called an amicus brief seeking to influence the judge in someone else's lawsuit. Okay, so this is not your lawsuit, but you're allowed to state your piece to the judge in this special document called an amicus brief. If you look at that prefix, ami, it's related to the French word ami for friend, the Spanish word amigo for friend. So amicus brief is basically saying, hey judge, I'm your friend. It's also called a friend of the court brief. You're saying, hey judge, I'm your friend. I want to bring this information to your attention so that you can rule accordingly. Brief just means legal memorandum, legal memo. And it's kind of a misnomer because legal briefs are rarely brief. Okay, so these amicus briefs can be 10, 20, 30, 40 plus pages long. They're filled with legal research, maybe factual citations as well, and supporting evidence. So it's really a big endeavor to file one of these things. For example, the current same-sex marriage laws, the Obergefell case that went up to the Supreme Court. So the interest groups that wanted to legalize same-sex marriage got together. They found sympathetic homosexual couples that had been denied marriage licenses, and they filed their test cases. These test cases went up to the Supreme Court. And many people who were not involved in the test case itself filed amicus briefs. Okay, so you had people who were in favor of same-sex marriage. They filed amicus briefs with the Supreme Court. People who were in favor of traditional marriage, one man and one woman, they filed amicus briefs with the court as well. So any significant case in front of the Supreme Court, for example, if you go on their website and look, you'll be able to pull down amicus briefs by different interest groups that are trying to let the judge know, hey judge, I'm your friend and I think you should rule in a particular way. So not only do we try to influence members of Congress with these various tactics like lobbying and fundraising, but interest groups also try to influence public policy indirectly through the court system. And the idea is if you can't get something through legislation, try litigation. In addition to lobbying Congress, in addition to filing lawsuits, interest groups also try to influence the public, i.e. you. So let's talk about grassroots for a minute. A grassroots campaign is a campaign that's staffed by ordinary local volunteers. Okay, lots of interest groups like to think that their campaigns, their efforts are supported by ordinary people. Ordinary people picketing, distributing literature, having meetings, making phone calls, sharing on social media, etc. Because we live in a democratic society. People have an influence on public policy. Voters have influence on politicians, and so it's important to educate and influence the voters. Now, there's something else you should be aware of called AstroTurf. Okay, AstroTurf involves paid professionals who mimic a grassroots effort, often through social media. Okay, social media makes it very difficult to organize an AstroTurf campaign. So basically, what you do is you can create multiple social media accounts on different platforms, and you can share different quotes and different ideas in such a way that looks like these ideas have broad support and are being shared by many people, when actually it's just an effort by paid professionals. If you click on this link here, it will take you to a TED Talk by Sharyl Attkisson. That's S-H-A-R-Y-L Attkisson, A-T-T-K-I-S-S-O-N. And I encourage you to Google this TED Talk, Sharyl Attkisson, on how to recognize AstroTurf. So she gives a good overview of AstroTurf, how these paid interests try to influence what we believe and what we understand about the world, and how they use social media to do that. She uses quite a few examples from the pharmaceutical industry. So anyway, I encourage you to click on that link in the PowerPoint, or else just Google Sharyl Attkisson TED Talk AstroTurf, how to recognize AstroTurf. It's a very helpful summary. Okay, let's talk about what is media exactly. Media are the main platforms for communicating information to the public. Okay, so these are the ways that we communicate to the public at large. And now there's different kinds of media. Okay, so the media can communicate news, information on what's happening around the world. They can communicate opinion. So this is kind of a gloss or an interpretation of the news. The media can put out entertainment, which is just really for fun. And the media can also put out advertising. Advertising is an attempt to influence us to buy a product or service. So ads are paid for by these business interests or other interests to influence the public. Okay, so these different categories of media are actually very important to keep separate. It's good to know, am I looking at news? Am I looking at opinion? Am I looking at entertainment? Or am I looking at advertising? Traditional media includes print, newspapers and magazines, and broadcast, radio, TV, cable, and now satellite. And of course, today we have the internet and social media. As we discussed earlier, people prefer to get their news online. Here's a study from the Pew Research Center. They're saying nearly the same share of Americans prefer to get local news online as on the television set. That's skewed because I'm sure they interview people from different age ranges. The Pew Research Center has other studies that show that the vast majority of young people, college students, get their news online and don't even bother looking at television or newspapers or radio. The history of the news in this country is very interesting. The history of media. In the beginning, at the time of the founders, the media was very decentralized. Okay, so every town would have a print shop. If you could afford to buy a printing press, then you could have your own newspaper, right? Sometimes you had competing newspapers in a town, so the news was very decentralized, and as a result, it was quite partisan. Okay, so you had different newspapers that represented different interest groups. As time went on, and especially during the progressive era, news became more centralized. Remember, the progressive era brought the idea that society should be more efficient, more centralized, more dependent on experts. And so there arose this class of expert journalists, okay, and they had a code of ethics, and Americans really looked to these particular wise journalists and key newspapers and magazines for their information about the world. So there was a high level of trust in a professional journalist class. Okay, today we're kind of reverting back to decentralized media with the internet and with social media. Okay, so now anybody with a computer can have a blog or a podcast or a YouTube channel. So media has gotten very decentralized. It's no longer professional. It can be done by amateurs. And there's good and bad things about this development, right? So when you have a lot of proliferation of different outlets, there's more checks and balances. So there's a wider range of information out there. At the same time, it's a lot more chaotic and confusing. It can be difficult to tell who's giving truthful information and who's just sharing fake news, right? We don't have single broadcasters or single channels that we can intuitively trust and have a common narrative for the nation. And I think with the chaos and with the proliferation, we also have polarization with people identifying and listening to outlets that kind of cater to more extreme points of view. Okay, so our country's news situation, the media situation, is very chaotic. It's full of amateurs, not professionals, proliferation of information. Again, this can be good. This can be checks and balances on the system, but it can make it very confusing to figure out the truth. So it's important to know how to recognize bias in the media. One way the media shows bias is just by what facts it chooses to cover, what stories it picks and chooses. So, you know, there's a limited amount of resource for any media outlet, and the question is, what stories do they focus on? Here's an example involving two politicians. On the left, you see Sarah Palin. She is a Republican politician, former governor of Alaska, former candidate for vice president. She was on Facebook, and you can click through the link there if you want to take a look at it. And she made a comment to the effect that Kodiak Island in Alaska is the biggest island in America. So she was bragging on her home state a little bit. And then the media immediately made fun of her, saying she forgot all about Hawaii, right? So Hawaii actually is the biggest island in America. So they were laughing at Sarah Palin reporting on this slip up. Obviously, she was just bragging on Alaska and was not thinking about Hawaii at the time. Interestingly, President Obama made a similar mistake. He was given a speech. He was actually in Hawaii, and he said, when I speak with world leaders, whether it's at home or here in Asia, and he actually was not in Asia, he was in Hawaii. And it's very interesting who covered the story about President Obama's speech. It was actually the right-leaning news outlets, Glenn Beck's The Blaze, Fox News, etc. Okay, so the left-wing media gets all excited about a little mistake by Sarah Palin, and the right-leaning media gets all excited about a little mistake by President Obama. Now, these are the kind of mistakes anybody can make at any time, right? I mean, we're all human. We're all subject to little brain freezes and slips of the tongue. And really, neither of these stories should have been national news. What's more important, the policies that these people represent, or the fact that they're human and have little slips from time to time? So it's very interesting to look at which outlets cover these little slip-ups by which individuals. This can even happen, you know, when it gets down to the details or the facts of a story. I have two stories here, one from the Washington Post, one from the Washington Examiner. They both involve the same basic story. So here's Washington Post. Baker claims religious persecution again, this time after denying cake for transgender woman. So this is the story of Jack Phillips, owner of Masterpiece Cake Shop. He came under attack and his case went up to the Supreme Court when he refused to bake a cake for same-sex weddings. So that case was resolved actually in Jack Phillips' favor. But now the cake at the center of the controversy was not for a wedding. Colorado lawyer Autumn Scardina called Masterpiece Cake Shop to request a custom cake, blue on the outside and pink on the inside, to celebrate her birthday, as well as the 7th anniversary of the day she had come out as transgender. And the Washington Post goes on and talks about the dispute between Jack Phillips, the owner of the bakery, and the attorney, and it sounds very neutral. But they left out some important facts that you would like to know. So here is the Washington Times. The Washington Times says that Mr. Phillips has faced venomous harassment, including death threats and countless hateful phone calls. He's also lost 40% of his income and had to cut more than half of his workforce. And he said a Colorado lawyer, August, who appears to be the same person as Autumn Scardina, has made a crusade out of pestering him with outrageous cake requests and then complaining to state officials when he refuses. For example, the attorney not only asked for a blue and pink transgender cake, the attorney asked for a birthday cake for Satan, showing the Prince of Darkness smoking marijuana. Also asked for cakes featuring, I'll just read this, claiming to be from the Church of Satan, emailing a request for a 3-tier cake with a large figure of Satan licking a sex toy. Okay, so, you know, that's also important information, that it wasn't just an innocent request for a cake, which the baker refused, but actually this attorney had made kind of a crusade of pestering the baker with these cake requests over a long period of time. So again, depending on, and you may be more sympathetic with the Jack Phillips, the baker, you may be more sympathetic with Scardina, the attorney. Nonetheless, these facts are important, and you would probably want to know those facts regardless of what side you were on. Okay, the media also shows bias in how it covers stories. Okay, they actually teach you this in law school, right? So you go to law school and they have a course in legal writing, And in the legal writing course, they say that your legal briefs, your legal memorandum, should have 2 sections. The first section is called the facts, where you talk about the facts. And then the second section is the argument, where you argue how the law should be applied based on the particular set of facts. And it seems pretty straightforward, facts versus argument, but in reality, they teach you this in law school. They say your argument starts in the facts section. The argument starts in how you present the facts, because when you present the facts, okay, there's ways of crafting a narrative, ways of telling a story, where you can emphasize certain facts, de-emphasize others. The words that you choose to represent the facts can have meaning as well, so you can choose words that sound nicer or words that sound harsher, depending on what you want the judge to do. Okay, so and they train you to do that because lawyers are paid to be advocates. Okay, so when you're an attorney and you go to court, your client is not paying you to have a completely neutral recitation of the facts and say, okay, judge, you do what you think is best. That's not the role of an attorney. The role of an attorney is to be a paid advocate for the client, to argue on behalf of the client, and to do that you have to use all methods at your disposal, including how you talk about the facts. Okay, so you want to spin the facts as hard as you can, but you don't want to actually lie. Of course, that would be a violation of your ethics. Now, journalists are supposed to be different. Journalists are supposed to be neutral. They're not paid to advocate for anyone. Usually, they're supposed to be paid just to report on the facts, okay? And we expect our journalists to report in a neutral manner, but that does not always happen. So I'm going to give you another example here, same set of facts, but the language used to describe them is totally different. There were a series of undercover videos with the target being Planned Parenthood, okay? So this group went undercover. They pretended to be a research company interested in the, we'll call it, products of abortion. And they also, they actually caught these Planned Parenthood executives and Planned Parenthood doctors talking about selling the products of abortion to these research companies. Okay, so it was a big scandal. And so most major news outlets reported on this, but they reported on it very differently. So if you click the 2 links here, you can see the different ways that the story was reported. Fox News did not pull any punches. Okay, Fox News said, shock video, Planned Parenthood sells dead baby body parts. Okay, boom, in your face. If you click on MSNBC, that description is quite different. It says that Planned Parenthood is under fire for heavily edited videos suggesting that the healthcare organization facilitated the donation of fetal tissue. Okay, very different words. Facilitated donation of fetal tissue versus sells dead baby body parts. Okay, so very different reporting of the same story, and you can almost ask, hey, is this even the same story? How can it be reported in 2 very different fashions? So that's something to keep your eye on. Okay, what facts are being left out? How are the facts described? What stories are being focused on? And do these things taken together show any kind of bias? In addition, the media will often choose the sensational over the serious. Okay, we like to think about the media as being a watchdog, keeping government and businesses accountable, but many times that's not the case. So if you click on this picture here, you'll see a clip by the Huffington Post. It's actually a montage of news reports. And basically, this was when Mitt Romney was running against President Obama. Okay, and for president, Romney ended up losing, of course. But the media dug up this story apparently 30 years ago or so, back in the 1980s. Mitt Romney went on a family road trip. He had a lot of kids and he had a dog. There wasn't enough room in the car for the dog, so he put the dog up in a carrier on top of the car. And that created a lot of outrage. People thought it was inhumane to transport your dog in a carrier on top of the car. So the dog's name was Seamus Romney. It was a big thing. Everybody was talking about Seamus Romney and piling on Mitt Romney for doing this back in the 80s. Okay, so I have to tell you that the rules for transporting kids back in the 80s were very, very different. Okay, so this was before car seat laws. People were just smushed into the back seat of the car willy-nilly. Okay, very different perspective. And the question is, what's more important, Mitt Romney's policies or how he transported his dog back in 1983? Why did the dog story get so much coverage? Okay, obviously, Mitt Romney's policies are a lot more important. But the problem is that discussions about policy, they can be complicated, they can be boring. A story about a dog has instant emotional appeal. You can also see in that same clip some excerpts from Fox News, where Fox News is talking about President Obama eating dog meat as a child in Indonesia. And again, why is that even important that President Obama was fed dog meat in another country while he was a kid? He had nothing, no power over the situation, right? So again, just trying to evoke an emotional reaction, probably to entertain with sensational stories, but totally avoiding the more important issues about their policies. Okay, and what's really interesting is there were enough networks and enough segments talking about both of these incidents that the Huffington Post could do a whole montage about it. Okay, so when you see the media emphasizing kind of the fluffy story that has emotional appeal but no true importance, okay, you wonder whether some bias is at work. So here we have our little love triangle. Both government and business interests influence what we see on the media. There's this push and pull. I have a book here. It's called Stonewalled by Sharyl Attkisson. Okay, so Sharyl Attkisson, she's the one I encouraged you to look up her TED Talk on AstroTurf. Okay, and if you're interested in journalism, this is a great book to read, Stonewalled. So anyway, reading from her book, she talks about this weird push and pull between different influences on the media. She says, if you're confused about all the influences behind what you see on the news and how they affect the product, there's good reason. At times, there's a liberal political bias in the mainstream media that tilts toward stories favoring liberal social issues and philosophies. But there's also a competing conservative corporate bias that favors specific companies, industries, and paid interests. Unfortunately, the result isn't an ideal balance of complete information about the world. So it's not like these different influences kind of balancing each other out. In fact, what you get is a funhouse mirror, a distorted and perplexing mix. The trend has become more predominant in the last couple years as powerful interests have mastered their methods of influencing us, and as some of our managers, the news managers, have embraced the influence, believing they'll keep their lucrative jobs by going along rather than resisting. Let's talk about some of these influences. The media is responsible for covering news about companies, but these same companies buy ads. Okay, so the media is beholden to companies that advertise on their stations, and so when these companies suggest stories, the media is likely to pick them up. We'll talk more about that in a minute. We've talked about the relationship between industry groups and the government. These corporations and interest groups lobby the government. They may make donations to politicians' re-election campaigns, and in turn, the government is supposed to regulate these same companies. So again, the same kind of influence, conflicts of interest. Even between the media and the government. The media is supposed to cover the government and keep it accountable, but the government has some leverage over the media too. The government provides the media with access. We'll talk about that. Atkinson says that because of all these influences on the media, number one, there's a lot of what she calls milquetoast news, the same kind of fluffy, safe stories that everybody feels comfortable with. She says all the networks have several minutes on the weather. Everybody has story on the Olympics. Everybody has the exact same feature about a woman who saved her baby nephew's life, a story that was circulated on the internet the day before. Okay, so many television news networks will take some feel-good story from social media and run about that. This was during President Obama's term, so they're all reporting on his decision to award the Medal of Honor, etc. And she says her network, she used to work for CBS, she says CBS was passing up all kinds of stories on the crumbling Affordable Care Act, an exclusive investigation about a significant military controversy, an investigation uncovering a history of troubles surrounding Boeing's Dreamliner, and massive government waste, fraud, and abuse. Countless stories about pharmaceutical dangers, privacy infringement, the debate over President Obama's use of executive orders, the FDA monitoring of employee email, the expansion of terrorism, the student loan crisis, the explosion in entitlements, the fallout from the Haiti earthquake, on and on and on. Atkinson says these are all very meaty stories worthy of our attention, but because the media is afraid of offending these various interests, whether government interest or corporate interests, many times they'll stick to fluffy things like weather and the Olympics. She also talks about her feeling, as an investigative journalist, Atkinson wants to be bold, wants to follow the facts wherever they lead, right? So she considers herself a professional bound by journalistic ethics, and she wants to get to the truth of a matter. But she says sometimes we're little more than casting agents. So she's just enacting a play that's dreamed up by her New York managers. They not only assign the topic, they tell us whom we should interview, what they should say, how the story should be written. We're asked to create a reality that fits their New York image of what they believe, what they've read, what they've been told by their contacts, or what they've heard at parties. She says for these types of managers, you gather the information in the field. And if the truth doesn't reflect their preconceived notions, they'll either change the story so it does or it won't air. They use heavy-handed editing to alter the script so that it's written in their style using their thoughts and their language. So Atkinson is complaining that she's not being allowed to follow the facts, not being allowed to develop what's actually going on, but she's just playing a role, kind of filling in the outlines of a prescription that she's been given by her managers that won't offend powerful interests. Speaking of corporate influences on the media, sometimes it can be hard to tell the difference between news and advertising. As an example, you can click on this link here. This is a little segment by John Rutland. John is a filmmaker. He's a cinematographer. He's actually my youngest brother, okay? This is my baby brother, John. I'm very proud of him. He lives in Hollywood. And he filmed the movie Paranormal Activity Ghost Dimension. Fortunately, Paranormal Activity Ghost Dimension did not come to Ruston, Louisiana, because otherwise I would have been guilted into watching it, and the thing would have given me nightmares for weeks. Okay, so this is a clip by John Rutland. This particular clip was for USA Today, which is a news network. And if you play the clip, you'll see John Rutland. He's talking about how he filmed Paranormal Activity Ghost Dimension. And he's kind of a nerd about lighting. So he also talks about his favorite lights, including these Philips Hue light bulbs. And as you're watching it, you're realizing this is not a news segment. This is kind of an ad. An ad, it's like a double whammy. Not just for the movie Paranormal Activity, it's also an ad for these Philips Hue light bulbs. And the crazy thing is that this segment is not identified as an ad. It's just a regular news segment. In fact, sometimes when I've played this clip in my class, it'll be preceded by an ad that you have to click through in order to get to the segment. So I talked to my brother about this, and he said, yeah, it's a weird world of cross-media and brand marketing that we live in, but as long as I get paid and or get free stuff, I'm cool with it. Okay, so, there are people who get a benefit from this type of media, which is a weird blend of news and advertising. Here's another example. If you click on the little icon of the Doritos taco, okay, this is a segment on CBS this morning, and here's Cheryl Atkinson describing this segment. She calls it the mysterious case of the incredibly unwarranted national news coverage of Taco Bell Dorito shells. CBS This Morning features a 4.5-minute interview with Taco Bell CEO Greg Creed. Now, I've asked my students, okay, the CEO of Taco Bell, very powerful guy. He's Australian, so he's fun to talk to as well. And there's lots of questions that you could ask Greg Creed, Taco Bell CEO, that would be newsworthy. Okay, you can ask him about how they treat their workers. You could ask him how they source their food, right? So there's different questions that you could ask. You could ask about how they impact the environment, or how they impact the communities where their stores are located. You could even ask him about his personal life, to the extent, okay, if a young person is interested in getting involved with business, do you have any suggestions for them? You could ask a little career advice for you business students. But CBS This Morning did not ask any of these questions. They basically were just complimenting Taco Bell. Listen to this: a taco shell made out of nacho cheese Doritos. I'm curious about where the idea came from. So they talk about the promotion of the product. And at one point they even play Taco Bell's Super Bowl commercial. So they talk about Taco Bell's decision to have a commercial during the Super Bowl, and they play excerpts from the Super Bowl commercial as if that's news. So they're playing a commercial as if the commercial itself was news. And then they say things like, nicely done, Taco Bell, I love it, I love it. The Doritos Locos Taco is quite a concept. And so it's really just kind of a 4.5-minute fawning ad about Taco Bell, a marketing coup for Taco Bell. A national news organization has been convinced to treat product promotion as if it's a big breaking news story. And what's really interesting is once CBS ran this story, other media outlets picked it up. New York Daily News, Time Newsfeed, BuzzFeed, Business Insider, Gawker, Daily Finance, Huffington Post, they all advanced the promotion as well, and they credit CBS This Morning for being the first to break this big story. Atkinson says, a note to self, there's no time for an exclusive story exposing wrongdoing inside a corporation or government agency. They're too busy chasing that Taco Bell Doritos exclusive. So just an example. Okay, watch out for news outlets. They give you entertainment as news. They give you advertising as news that have bias in how they describe the news. If you keep your eyes open and just do a little digging, it'll help you recognize and identify fake news. Even the bureaucratic agencies today are media savvy. Okay, so government agencies will actually lobby the news media for favorable coverage, and they will use access to important government figures as leverage over the media. Cheryl Atkinson had experience with this as well. So she was doing a story on the controversial decision by the Transportation Security Administration, the TSA, to allow small pocket knives back on planes. The knives had been banned, and so there was some discussion about whether to allow pocket knives back on planes. They asked for an interview with the head of TSA, John Pistole. TSA denied the request. The government, according to Atkinson, did not feel a responsibility to be accountable, and the media accepts the denial without pressing. But as the days passed, criticism mounted over the TSA's proposed policy, and the issue captures the public attention. A week after denying our interview request, TSA calls us at CBS and the other networks. TSA says Pistole will be available to us today. He wants to make TSA's case. His press officers dictate the terms. The boss will do brief one-on-one interviews at the agency's Virginia office. The problem, according to Atkinson, is that she did her story a week ago. That's when she needed the interview. She wasn't planning another story today, and this Pistole interview a week later wasn't exactly promising to be newsy. But CBS does not tell the TSA no. They dutifully rush their cameras to their offices as directed, do the interviews in the order they determine in the time slots they assign for the length of time that they determine, during which Pistole offers carefully prepared, well-vetted answers and no new information. Then we clear a spot in the evening newscast for the resulting story and call it quote-unquote news. What just happened here? The TSA dictated the terms of news coverage. When the media initiate a story worth covering, the government balks. But when they need us, we're compliant. It's important, says Atkinson, for those in the media to resist this dynamic because we risk becoming little more than tools in their propaganda efforts, serving their interests rather than holding them accountable and serving the public's interest. In addition, many government agencies even have their own media facilities paid for with taxpayer dollars. So this is very interesting. Atkinson says government agencies self-produce videos and have built their very own television production facilities where the upper echelon give interviews and speeches controlling everything from content to lighting. While the nation has descended into unprecedented debt, Congress and federal agencies ranging from the Department of Health and Human Services to the National Institutes of Health have been using millions of your tax dollars to build or expand their television studios. For example, the Food and Drug Administration's facility boasts a number of mobile and fixed sets, as well as various configurations to allow for a studio audience of over 100. The Transportation Security Administration sports a studio with Hitachi high-definition cameras, Fujinon lenses, LCD-based teleprompters mounted on Venton Vision Studio pedestals, and Vision 20 fluid heads. Okay, I don't understand what that is, but my brother John certainly does. And when top officials with those federal agencies appear on camera, naturally they have to look good, so your tax dollars may kick in for the cost of hairstylists, makeup artists, wardrobe consultants, etc. If you want to look at an example, you can click on the picture here in the PowerPoint. This is Linda Douglas, an official in the Obama administration, producing a video where she defends President Obama's policies against some detractors on the internet. So you can see she has her computer screen up. She's targeting a particular website, the Drudge Report, and trying to refute some articles that the Drudge Report has run. So you can see government agencies even have their own media facilities and are putting out content. So for all these reasons, the media may stick with the safe stories to avoid hassle, please their advertisers, please government authorities, and avoid being cut out of the loop. All right, that's the end of the lecture on the media. It's a little shorter because, this is about the media, and I encourage you to watch the clips that I've talked about. If you could prepare for the next lecture, we're starting our fourth and final unit on the judiciary, civil rights, and civil liberties. So to do that, it'd be helpful for you to read Article 3 of the Constitution, which is all about the court system, and also read Federalist Essay 78, which is also about the federal court system. So I will see you next time.